Hey everybody, Larry, Fort Worth Memories Museum and Group and Hometown Heroes. It's Tuesday morning at 10 and that's Hometown Heroes time. Rick, Mary, y'all can introduce your guest and
Thank you
we'll
very
get
much,
started.
Larry. It's good to be here. Another
Good morning.
Tuesday, episode 14.
Yeah.
And Mary's here, the president of Roll Call. And we have one of our Roll Call members, Chuck Hodge. And Chuck is a oral historian.
That's
is
right.
Is that kind of what you do?
That's where I would define it. Not
Okay.
an historian, but an oral
Okay.
historian.
And there's a difference, and we're going to find out what that difference is. Chuck was raised in Duncanville and then moved to Dallas. Your parents were both educators. Your mother taught at Highland Park.
Both were
Okay.
teachers and coaches.
Okay.
My dad was an A&M graduate. He walked on at A&M in the late 40s, early 50s, and was a starting tight end for them for years,
Wow.
several years. And
I knew I liked him.
Yeah,
and my mother, she didn't go to college until she was until we were in the first, second, and third grade. She helped get my dad out of A&M. He was terribly dyslexic. I'd heard the term, but you don't realize it until you see it.
right.
And so she got him through A&M. He was good at math, but reading skills were really poor, which is pretty typical. So she started in the first, second, third grade, got her undergrad at the University of Texas. What is now the University of Texas was Arlington State College at the time. And she was in Who's Who, got her undergrad in math. She got her master's in math at Stetson. We used to go to Florida every summer. And we moved from Duncanville to Dallas. Dallas Highland Park offered her a teaching position and a coaching position. She was the tennis coach.
Wow.
And so, when you have two teachers for parents, you learn to, and one's a football player, you learn behavior very quickly. And so that was kind of my background. And then I went through Duncanville schools and then Highland Park and graduated in 71 and then attended Rice on a track scholarship. And I was a hurdler at school. And then I got sick one year with hepatitis. And at that time, Rice did not have summer school. Probably, I don't know if they do now or not, but they took very few credits outside the school. So I just asked if I could come back and play baseball, which meant I got to go to school another year. And so I started and got to play baseball. And the only thing I started except against left-handers, and I'm a lefty. So that's if you're a left-hander, you know how wicked a left-handed curve is when it comes at you. You just don't see it very often. But the only thing I think I hit of any importance at all was a grand slam home run against the University of Houston. Now, they were ranked 15 in the country, but it was a complete fluke. I had 2 strikes and no balls. And after the second one, I walked away and started beneath my breast. The profanity was really coming out. And so I walked up, and he pitched me the same ball right down the gut. All I did was swing, and it was just a line drive that went over the fence. I have no recollection of hitting the ball, much less, I just thought it was a single. And they just, that means a home run, that symbolism. And that was my highlight. But we still have the record shuttle hurdle relay team. You don't see that very often.
That's good.
Rice. It'll be there forever because you just can't find 4 hurdlers, especially college, because they're different than high school. They're higher, so it's a completely different race. And a lot of kids cannot adapt to the higher altitude. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I guess your next question is, how did I get into this? And the answer is my dad was an Aggie, and I knew what I wanted to do long before I did it. It was kind of osmosis. They seep in. The Aggie band, if you've seen the Aggie band, there's nothing like it in the country at all. And the core, the traditions of the core just kind of seeped in. I didn't go to A&M, but those all seeped in. And I remember watching The Longest Day about 30 times in DeLand, Florida at the old theater. And then when 12 O'Clock High, if anybody's seen it, it's a great movie. It's one of the greatest movies of all time. It's really stimulating. And then the third time was Private Ryan. So one of them hit me from a curiosity standpoint, which was Longest Day. The second one hit me from an emotional standpoint. impact. And that was the 12 o'clock high. What people go through, the tensions of going through a war is like, how you handle it. And the third one just put it straight in your face, and that was Spielberg's Private Ryan. And I just decided then we're going to Normandy. I'd always wanted to go, so we went to Normandy, and we've been back 15 to 16 times.
Wow.
And so the first time we went, we were kind of dumbfounded at how much the French actually cared, because you hear in the States, and maybe that's only Normandy, but the bands, the festivals, the groups in the small villages that would meet and feed the paratroopers. And I really became infatuated with the paratroopers. It's just a zany group of human beings. And so I took a camera, and the next time I said, I'm going to get a movie camera this time. And so I started filming some of the ceremonies and said, why don't you start talking to these people? And so that's where it started, kind of I always call it a snowball that became an avalanche. And I think you're very familiar with that.
Yes.
Mhm.
So that's when I started interviewing, and I didn't know what I was doing. I had no idea what I was doing, but I knew I wanted to do it.
But you know, whenever you don't know what you're doing, then however you do it is the right way to do it.
Mhm.
If
You
you
know,
like
it's your
what you
way.
do, you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
You know, you'll always figure it out. And I was lucky enough in Dallas at the time, I stumbled on a group called the Happy Warriors. And here, this is Fort Worth, but in Dallas, it was just a group of, it was a collection of really World War II aviators more than anything. And I started doing their programs because they didn't have many programs. And we had David Braden was our MC, the only officer allowed, even though we had a few Medal of Honor recipients. We had generals. We had everybody in there. They flew every plane there was in World War II, bombardiers, navigators, pilots, crew chiefs, you name it, they were there. And so I started asking them if I could interview them. And I was working at the time, so I didn't have as much time as I do today to interview. So the interviews were much shorter and not as comprehensive, but they were teaching me things. And I would read books. I have 400 books at home that I've read, which again, that's not an historian, just means you're a reader. That's all it means. So I started interviewing them on a little camera with this mini DVDs back
Sure.
and they're terrible, but that's what I started out with. And they would start mentioning things. That would be a good question, you know? And so I just started listening, and that's how I just evolved over time. But it was that group of men and women who really taught me how to interview, and they were more than happy to let me interview. But, you know, you have to build up trust. There's nothing like trust. And they have to trust you that you're not trying to take advantage of them. So I had to, when I decided what I wanted to do, you have to decide how you're going to do it and what parameters you're going to set. And I set these, the first parameters were, these are only for families. They are not for public consumption. I'll never they can do what they want to with them. It's their interview. I keep a copy in case it's lost. You know, these veterans, they didn't know how to use a computer. They put them in a drawer, they lose them. So later on, families contact you, could we get a copy? And so I always kept a copy. I still have all copies of them, backups of backups now. But I just decided they're going to be very private. You know, I could attach it to a GoFundMe site on our web, and that's perfect. That's the way I should have done it. But I just decided I'm going to keep this very, very private. I decided that that I would probably donate these, and who to donate them to, and who would not put them up on public display to make money, but for researchers. And so that I've got a kind of a list of 3, and there may be more. These may evolve differently than they are now, but that's what I plan on doing. Now, when it came to who do I interview, it started out as only World War II veterans, and I began to include Korea. And then I said, you're not branching out enough, because there are different sides of World War II. There are not only the veterans, the frontline veterans, there are rear line veterans. There are wives of veterans, which is a story that's not been told, especially if they have children, their husbands are overseas, the trauma they went through. Then you have women who were involved in the WASP, the Rosie the Riveter, and all sorts of different ways that women participated in World War II. So, and a few Gold Star mothers, which are really tough interviews. That and Bataan Death March survivors, in those type of environments, those are the toughest ones you can go through, because I decided I did not want to pursue the crying angle. You know, you see so many interviewers that are looking for that tear, and I said, I'm going to stay away from that. I tried to. So I tried to tap dance around those emotional minefields, and you don't know where they are. You think you know where they are, but you can tell when you're encroaching into something. You pull back out real quick.
Sure.
Let them talk about what they want to talk about, but don't force it. It doesn't ruin the interview, but I don't think it's not fair to them to take them through something like that just so you can get a moment's notice on your show. Matter of fact, one of my first interviews was a guy named Tom Young. He lived in Mountain View. I think it was on the way to Fredericksburg when I was a volunteer with him. And Tom was a 101st Airborne paratrooper, jumped on D-Day. His brother was with the 82nd, also jumped on D-Day. And I got to know them through a crazy character named Jake Mcneese. I don't know if you ever read the book, The Filthy 13, but he was an absolute wild man. The man who wrote the book said that wasn't even close to how wild he was. He just got busted constantly. He did not he put the ugly on officers, but they're paratroopers. It's a different group of people. And I'm talking to Tom, and he's telling me, I'm not leading him to anything. He goes straight into the Normandy invasion. And when he jumped, and all of a sudden he and Jake were good buddies, became best buddies at this time. You remember being in the hedge fields, not right at St. Mary-Glise, but in that area. And you remember Jake Mcneese coming down the hedgerow. He said he had news for him that his brother had been killed.
Mm.
And at that time they were really bonded. But it also and he started crying. And I just popped it off. I said, I can't. I didn't know how to handle it. I just started. And I said, well, I don't know what do I do? You know, you really don't know until you're there. You think you know until you're there. Then you really find out. And so, that was kind of my first time into that. Everything that I said I didn't want to do happened. And so I'm unnerved. I'm probably more unnerved than he is. And so I cut it off. But we ended up having a good interview, and I came back and re-interviewed him another couple of years later. But that's kind of the gist of what I do. And I take notes, but I can't read them. I'm left-handed, and my people, we were discriminated. The right-handers had the right-handed desk, and you don't realize that until you're a lefty. That arm's flapping out there. You've got chicken scratch, and I really can't read it about 3 days later. And so even this, I have trouble reading it. But that's kind of what I do and what I determined to do. It wasn't a numbers game, but I wanted to get to as many people as I possibly could get to, because I fully realized that this would go. I wanted to go on long after I'm gone and long after they're gone, so that their families will have something about what would be their dad, their granddad, the great-great-granddad, and on down the line. So I felt this would give not only something about the war, but something about them growing up, which came in as I talked to some of the happy warriors. And they would tell me, the Depression, that just opened up a whole new world to me as we started talking about it. And I'd read a few books about it. And so my questions got a little more in depth, and the interviews were taking a lot more time. And I didn't have enough time while you're working to break it up. I rarely did. I do that a lot today. And especially World War II Depression era, we'll go up to service and then service on. But that's kind of what I've done for all these years, and I just can't let go of it. Well, you know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
Anybody who volunteers, like Mary and Rick, you do it out of a passion.
Sure.
And it's something good after you're retired, but even before that, it's a good hobby and a meaningful hobby. It's something that, besides work, what you have to do to make money, this is something that gives me some credibility. So it's not just a one-way street. I get something out of this too.
If you enjoy it, it's not a job at all. You look forward to it every day.
I think everybody wishes they had a job like that.
Oh yeah, no, they do.
And
Every day I wake up, it's like, who are we going to talk to today? Because I do 7 or 8 a day, 7 days a week.
If you see somebody walking down the street who goes to church and they're 94, 95 years old, full well they went through the Depression.
Oh yeah, they've got so much history. Story.
Even people in 88, 87, they were kids, and when they went through it, they'll remember the war. They'll remember when Pearl Harbor occurred. They'll remember the rationing in the war. It was tires, it was sugar, gas, a lot of different things were nylon. Women
I
used
had
to.
a guy call me, his sister called me, he's 87 or 88. He was one of the boat drivers at Omaha Beach. His job was to get the kids to the beach. And she said he's never talked about it. He's felt like his boat, every one of them died, every single one of them. And so I said, maybe my show is not the right show, but Hometown Heroes is. And she said it would have to be done where you kill it and splice. I don't know how we'll do it. I was going to talk to you about it, and he doesn't drive, but she said he wants to tell his story now. So, but everybody on his boat, they didn't make it off.
And that might be something that we do and then Chuck does.
Yeah. So, but I think she said 88. He's in fairly good health. His eyesight's not real good. And he just stopped driving, I think she said 2-3 years ago, but lives in way out Fort Worth. I think they live 30 or 40 miles outside Fort Worth. But she said he's always been burdened with that guilt. He said, I drove him and he told me, short synopsis, you couldn't get to the beach. You could only get like 20 or 30 yards from it. And machine gun fire, as soon as that tailgate went down, it was just everywhere. It was just bullets flying everywhere.
Yeah, they kind of funneled them in when they came to the beaches. They set up the tetrahedrons and Belgian gates. The Germans are pretty clever. They've been at this for a long time. But they funneled those boats into killing zones, which were pre-marked, not only from the machine guns, but from mortars and artillery behind. So when they walked into it, I mean, they were, you'd see entire boats wiped out. I don't know. Spielberg was spot on when he showed that boat where people were killed one after the other. It's a machine gun that shoots 1,200 rounds a minute.
Yes. And
not counting a mortar, not counting snipers. The first waves just did not have a chance at all. No. And part of it because we were going to bomb it with the bombers, but they delayed it by about 10 or 15 seconds. So they didn't hit the men on the beach. Well, 10 or 15 seconds in the air is a long way. You're blowing up, trees in the back. And so there wasn't a lot of damage.
They missed the beach. Yeah. They didn't bomb the beach at all.
No, very few hit it. If it was an accident, and bombing.
Yeah. They were 3 or 4 miles in, 12 miles in. Yeah.
But survivor's guilt is a real thing.
Yes.
There's a lot of people that carry that.
Yes.
And that was another reason, Mary, you hit on a point why I don't publish these things, because some of these interviews, I mean, I have a small camera up there, but it's a rolling conversation. It is, I'm asking questions. I'm also talking. So I want them to forget about the camera, which is an intimidation for a lot of folks. But some of these become confessions, and that's not going to go public. And I'm buzzed all the time about I need to put these on, to put them up on the air and share them with all these different types of people. But when you do that, you need to tell people that going in, because then their answers are different. Sure. And so I just
want to protect their relatives sometimes.
Well,
so their relatives don't know some of the things they did, maybe.
You want to protect others. Because you have to remember, this is a war. I mean, this is not like we're walking down the street. You don't know no matter what you think and how you think you're going to react. You really, for the most part, you have no idea.
Not a clue.
You can prepare people for it, but it is not the same when you get there. So it's very understanding why somebody would run. It's not human to stand there and be shot. It's just or have somebody take pot shots at you and trying to kill you. And when you've seen it, you're a different person. But it's interesting to see how many people all of a sudden, from the moment they go through the romance of war to the reality of it, they're in that distance, they're a completely different person. You'll never see the same person again, and you shouldn't.
And another thing, the soldiers, there were so many of them being shot. They were trained, do not stop. The corpsmen stop. You do not help. And that had to have played heavy, because they got to be close with the people that were next to them. And you see them that maybe they just lost an arm or something, but you can't stop. You got to keep going. They trained them, do not stop. And so it just defies, if you see an animal or a person hurt on the street, you're going to help. Here, just men dropping right and left, and there's nothing you can do. You just got to keep moving forward.
Yeah, the Marines were pretty good about that. The Army, not quite the same, but pretty close to it. That a medic could do more, even though Marines and they had medical training, but
Right.
not like a medic. But the other thing, when you're on those first waves, it's either kill or be killed. You move on. You
Right.
get out of there.
You got to get out of there.
If you stop, you can't get off. You saw what happened at Iwo Jima. You just can't get off. And it wasn't because they didn't want to, because they just weren't going to survive. Well, they just pound you. They know where you are. They know where you're coming, which is interesting because they knew where we were coming. You'd think we were going to fool them, but they know where we're going to
Sure,
land,
they
why
do.
you were going to land there. Well, so did we. So, like Tarawa, which turned out to be a big fiasco. How long it took to take a small little island and the death toll there. They were waiting coming in. They misjudged the tides. These guys were coming in, at low tides. So they were coming in, and they were walking. These guys had machines just being picked off, and they didn't have a chance. That's why we had so many casualties. And things like that also led to the reason we dropped the atomic bomb. It just went on and on and on the Pacific, from Tarawa to Peleliu to Guadalcanal, and then Guadalcanal, of course, and Saipan and Tinian. Then you go into Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Well, we knew what was going to happen in Japan. We had already broken their code. We knew what their defenses were. We were going to be killing a lot of women and children. They were going to come at us with forks. They knew exactly what was going to happen. And so that's why the Truman chose the atomic bomb. A tough decision, but when you look at all the other angles, how many were going to die, it was going to be a lot of people.
Well, and it took the second bombing. They didn't stop after the first. They wouldn't surrender.
Well, and they had changed their kamikaze techniques too.
Yeah.
They were only having to fly from small mountains, and they were not going after capital ships this time. They were going after troop ships.
Right.
And that would have been, it would not have been good. So it was the right decision, a terrible decision, but people criticize it, but they don't criticize it if they were on the front lines.
Mhm.
Yeah. Have you ever been to the Eisenhower house?
In Denison?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was there, and one of the curators, they were going to put it out, and I don't think they ever did. There was a speech in Dwight Eisenhower's back pocket during D-Day, and it was a speech saying it didn't work, and I'm pulling our troops out. We can't get in. So he didn't know if it was going to work or not either. It was a huge gamble, but we made it.
Well, he gambled at the right time. The Germans didn't expect it.
Right.
It just happened to be nasty weather and clearing, but nasty weather. And we captured, I think it was Iceland, or there was an island out there, Reykjavik, where there was a weather station. So we knew what was coming in. Matter of fact, Harold Taft was one of the meteorologists on Eisenhower's staff.
Yes.
And
I interviewed him. He told me that.
yeah. And so we knew what the weather patterns were going to be better than the Germans did. And so it turned out to be, a fortunate that it happened that way, because I'm not so sure we would have gotten off the beach if they'd released the tanks, and especially if they'd listened to Rommel, who had been bombarded by planes. He knew what the Americans could
That was
do.
their biggest mistake, not releasing the tanks. If they'd have released the tanks, it'd have been a different story.
Yeah, the only thing we had that they didn't have, we had Big Week before that.
Yeah.
And we bombed every airfield they had in France and in Germany and Belgium, everything we could to get them out of there, and that they would not be there at the beaches. And that proved fortuitous because they were not there. But that's when, if that had happened, we would have had to rely on our P-47s and Spitfires, and there was another Typhoons from the British. We'd have taken out quite a bit of them because we did delay them, but it was touch and go as it was.
Sure.
They were going to abandon Omaha Beach and come through Utah and the British and then encircle it. But it was the Germans were good at what they did. They were smart, intelligent, and they were ruthless. We were learning to be.
So, who's the highest ranking person that you've interviewed?
I think probably there have been a few generals, but probably we really became good friends. His name was Brigadier General James H. McPartland, or Jim McPartland. And Jim was one of our happy warriors and one of the finest men I've ever met in my life. He was career Air Force, Army Air Corps. He actually he was in the Air Force training before Pearl Harbor. And he was from Pontiac, Michigan. And he went through high school, was a tennis player. They didn't have many, they didn't really have a court. They used the wealthy people's houses over there at the course. That was where the high school worked out. But Jim, true to his form, all the way through his life, he used to go fetch tennis balls from these two Polish brothers so that he could play tennis against them. He loved tennis that much. So he would do things like that to get to the things that he wanted to do, go through those types of exercises. He went to Detroit for a couple of years. He ran out of money, didn't know what he wanted to do. But he used to hang around Selfridge Field, which is, in the Detroit area. And he'd watch those planes take off and land. He used to make, you remember balsa wood? Probably not, but the old balsa wood kits. Yeah. Well, he loved to make those with the rubber bands, and they had these competitions all through Michigan and in the Midwest. He used to watch them fly over his house, the Ford Tri-Motors. He ended up on it. One of them landed in a field. When they used to bring banners, the barnstormers, they'd come around. Yeah. And one of them was Roscoe. This wasn't Roscoe Turner, but Roscoe Turner's a good book to read by C.B. Glines. But the guy put him in the back. They didn't have any money. He just put him in the back, took him up, spun him around, and came back down. He was hooked on flying for the rest of his life. So he joined the Army. I guess it was the Army Air Corps and then the Army Air Force after 42 or 43, somewhere there was a change. And so he took his lessons. He met his first Texas Aggies in San Antonio, Randolph Field. He thought, these people are monsters. He said, they're monsters. He said he had never seen anything like this in his life. But he said, once I got to know them, they were great. But they came from A&M, which was a hardcore ROTC program, much like as tough as any at that time, as tough as any of the military institutions we had in the country. And so he took his instructions, from Randolphville, which is kind of the mecca if you're in flight. That is the field, and then Victoria and Charlotte. And he was going to be a fighter pilot with the 52nd Fighter Group. He had passed everything. He loved it. The only time he had a mishap was landing in a farmer's field on the way to San Antonio when he was training, and his instructor told him he could not fill up with gas. And Jim said, well, look at the gauges. I'm not going to make it back. He said, everybody else started with the same amount of gas. You're not filling up. Well, he didn't make it. He ended up flying around this airfield. And back in those days, when you landed, they teach you to look for a place to land constantly. They kill the motor, you start looking around. Well, he had run out of gas and he's gliding. And you always look for in the fields, you look for the rows. You don't land into the rows, perpendicular, parallel to them. So he was doing a really good job. He got it down and landed. He was a little too high. He said landed and went over and then bump. He just completely flipped over. Yeah, well, he's inside the cockpit digging his way out. And there's the farmer looking at him, telling him, you did a really good job. And he said, would you give me a hand? So he ends up making his way back to base. But little mishaps like that, it didn't. Some people might say that's enough of this. Because the planes back then were not reliable like they are today. They were just, World War I would be a perfect example of unreliable planes. How many wings fell off while they were training? We lost a lot of pilots. But Jim was set and go. He wanted to be a fighter pilot. He was going to be a P-40 or something. That was the big, at that time, that was P-40. The big fighter, yeah. And so they called out all these guys. The guys called them together. They all had their wings. Said, okay, so you guys, I have good news and bad news. You guys on this side of the letter are going to go to fighter school, are going to go on into advanced training. You guys on the right-hand side from these letters on are going to bomber school. And he was there with Bob Morgan. And both he and Bob Morgan, Memphis Bell pilot, both ended up being B-17 bombers. And he said he was crushed, but he wanted to fly. He said it didn't take much to learn how to fly the B-17. So he was in the first group that we sent over in the 91st Bomb Group at Bassingbourn. He was in the first group that went over to England. And these guys, he said the training we had, the British had about 450 to 60 hours in the planes that they were going to fly as bombers. We had 100 to 125. We didn't know how to fly formation. We had no idea how to fly formation. We weren't ready for the cold. He said, everybody on board, whether you were a navigator, whether you were a bombardier, whether you were a gunner, radio, you had very, very little training. They rushed us in to the front. So these guys, the first groups over, were true cannon fodder, and they took the beating. And not many of them came back out of those first cadres. But they said when we got over there, the other thing we didn't know, you can't prepare for the weather. Not like England. We had no idea. We saw fog that we just stretched for miles and miles, 10,000 feet up to the air. Said it just took, we had to learn how to train to fly and land on fog on instruments. And they'd learned on instruments, but in the fog, when you can't see, it's nerve wracking.
That's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he named his plane the General Ike. I had an artist paint General Ike on. When Eisenhower visited the base, he got to take Ike up into the cockpit and show him around the B-17. Later, his plane became the Shamrock Special. He said one of the worst things that was not reported during the war was that this is pre electric flight suits where you could plug them in. We just had, the mittens and the mohair. He said we had amputations right and left, arms and legs and fingers and feet, and said it just wasn't reported. But he said, despite that, we got better and better and better as we went along. And I remember asking him, he became a squadron commander in the 91st. And I asked him, well, how did you become a squadron commander? What did you have that others didn't have? And he said, I didn't. He said, I just survived. He said, it was that simple. 25 missions, your chances of making it through 25 missions were practically nothing. And that proved to be true. He said, you were just lucky. And, we just heard John Luckadoo talk to us. Right. Damn Lucky's his book. Mm-hmm. And it's that simple. Some people, I think you have to find a rationale why you lived and others didn't. And that's the guilt complex. Some turn to God. I mean, you search for any and every rationale you can get. Others turn, I was just lucky, and realize it from that. But they're always, you try to figure, why am I alive? And these people are, because they get to know them. In a crew, in a bomber, everybody. Your life is dependent on that rear gunner. But he was in the old B-17. I think they were the Fs. They didn't have a nose gun. He said it didn't take the Germans but 5 seconds to figure that out. They'd come through our formations with 20 millimeter cannons, and they shot us down right and left. They were better than the flak at that time. It said, it took a long time for us to get adjusted to even hitting the target. Sometimes we weren't within 30 miles of the target. We intentionally tried to avoid civilian areas. He said the British, they didn't care. They were going after any and everybody. But he said that we got better and better with the Norden bomb sight, which, as you know, that's what we used. It was so complex, the Germans could not emulate it. They couldn't copy it. Their manufacturing techniques weren't that refined. Now they were, Germans are great engineers, but that's one thing they could not touch. He said that was one of those instruments you needed a lot of time under duress to be able to understand it and how it works. And that proved throughout the war that he was right, because later in the war, we were hitting, not perfectly, but we were really hitting our targets then. But early in the war, we were missing them, unintentionally killing civilians, and that wasn't the purpose. But he was one of those guys that really made a big impression on me, just as a person, not as a general, because I said, General McPartley said, call me Jim. And I knew right off the bat that was a good man. He wasn't trying to take his rank and force it on you. He was on D-Day. He was there at the base in Bassingbourn, and word had leaked out. You can't keep a secret in the military. You really can't keep a secret anyway. But it leaked out that there was going to be on the 4th or the 5th. They were going to be ready for D-Day because they were going to bomb the beaches, and a little bit inland. And it was not his day. He was a squadron commander. Everybody took off. That was not his day to fly, because squadron commanders didn't fly every day. You'd have several squadron commanders. And so they went up. Everybody was gone. He was feeling bad for himself. So he went in and started playing cards with one of the officers, and he got a ring from the commander of the bomb wing. A commander of the bomb, not the 91st, but the bomb wing, the 91st was in. He was also stationed at the base. And he said, Jim, get ready. We're going up. Now they didn't have anything on base except an old Hanger Queen. And which meant they used it for spare parts, but they also kept it up because they would take people to Scotland. There were no guns on this. Now, this is D-Day, and there are no guns on it. He doesn't have a crew at all. He says, we're going up. And that was against orders right off the bat. So he's got to assemble a crew. So he goes and he gets a priest, he gets a photographer, he gets a couple of guys who were just on the ground crew. They wanted to go up, but he got a good navigator. The rest of the plane's useless. There are no bombs, there isn't a way to defend yourself. So they go up and he tells him, Jim, take me to the beach. Farm up with the squadron and take me to the beach. So they did. They go up, farm with the squadron, which he said you could just see for miles as far as you could see. So they followed him in because he wanted to assess the damage on the beach. And he said, and now this is foggy too. When you get up at a certain, it was very foggy where they were going. And when they got close to the beach, he says, Jim, take me down. And they were about, I think, 5,000 feet. He said, take me down. This is they were told not to do this. So they take him down to the beach. Says he's about at 800 feet. And Jim's sweating because he's now on instruments. And the navigator's saying, take a right, take a left, take a right, so many degrees. And you can't see where you are. And Jim, take it down. So they go down to 400 feet. And he said, my God, there was the beach right in front of us. The navigator really did his job and saved everyone on that ship because they could have run into anything out there, including other planes. But now you're at a disadvantage because not only are the Germans shooting at you, they're really shooting the ships, but the ships are shooting at the Germans. You're in a crossfire between the two of them. They're going over and under. And so they go down to the beach about 300 to 400 around Omaha Beach. And they go down Omaha Beach. Then they go up to the cliffs. And he said, we could see the Rangers going up the cliffs. And he said, and all of a sudden I started hearing rain hit our plane. Only, of course, it wasn't rain. It's flak.
Yeah.
But it's not German flak. It's American flak because no planes are supposed to be in that area. And there weren't any. No planes are supposed to be in that area at all. So they turn around and come back and say, we had lots of damage, but none on the engine or no major damage. But, that was one of those crazy stories that he had. No one would believe, but he repeated that at every meeting we ever had with the Happy Warriors. So he was, and just a great guy. He passed away in Colorado. He's at the DFW cemetery with his wife in one of the columbariums. So one of the things I do keep is where the veterans that I have interviewed, where they're buried. And I try to go back and take photographs and then add it to their file. So when that's or anything about their obituaries or any article about them, place it in the file. So that was one man that I really got to know well. And he was the highest ranking general that I remember. The problem is if you do
money
you can't remember. Pick out a few, and I just, oh my God, I started writing things down. I couldn't flip through that many to find the ones that I want, but I remember Jim and there were four, I guess five that I got to know. One guy was Bob Winters, Colonel Bob Winters. Now here's a man he went to Crozier Tech in Dallas, but didn't finish high school. His father died, was killed in a car wreck, so he had to start. His mother was an invalid, so he had to start finding a way to make money for the family. So he only had a bike. He took his bike downtown Dallas, got a job taking blank checks to a printing company that would put on people's names and addresses. And then he had that for a while. Then he started taking hats, the blocked hats for ladies. And he'd take those on his bike back and forth to the, from, places like Neiman Marcus to a rehatter, I guess is what they call them. And he'd make money, but he was making about $12 a week, but he wanted to fly. He always kind of wanted to fly. So he spent $8 of the $12 biking down to Redbird Airport to take his lessons. And that's with an instructor. And that's what a kid will do, when you have a passion. I wish I'd had that passion at that age. And so he took his lessons and had a pilot's license. And he was going to join the Navy, but he was flat-footed. They wouldn't take it. So he joined the Army Air Corps. And they took him all through training. But I think it just tells you the type of what he ended up shooting 2 airplanes down and had damages and improbables. And I asked him one time, what did it bother you didn't become an ace? And he said, Chuck, I've seen people eat themselves up because they weren't an ace. And I said, I was never going to let that bother me, because his camera on his plane went out for 6 weeks.
Mm.
So all the recordings of what he shot and probables and damage were never recorded.
Mm.
But he said, you can't let things like that eat you up. Later, he had about 6 or 7 degrees from the University of Texas at Dallas, North Texas State, and others. And he made a career out of the Air Force. And he was one of the ones who got in trouble when Vietnam was starting. He said, can we win it like this? You know, he's in the air, said, you can't win Vietnam fighting like this.
No.
And that's not the answer they wanted to hear. You could fight differently. And you know, I'm one of those guys that I don't know we could win it, but you had to do it like we did at the end. It was too late. You had to go after everything in North Vietnam, but we were afraid of the Chinese. And we could have won that thing. I mean, I'm just never one that says we can't. We just refused to. We fought it politically. But he was one of those guys who, you know, understood the practical side of life, what you have to do to get things like that. And one of my favorites too was one that I stumbled on, and I wrote some notes down here, but I stumbled on this. Somebody told me that she would be a good interview through the Happy Warriors. And it's my most surprising interview I've ever gone through. I really didn't know what I was walking into. And I really don't, because I don't have time to research and do the things I'd like to do. And her name was Barbara Glass Lamoureux, B. And if there were going to be a book written by somebody, it would be about B. We were just sitting down talking about her growing up. And here I'm finding out that her father was a well-known, wealthy lawyer working for a printing company in the Chrysler Building. Her mother came from a very wealthy family, but they got a divorce, New York divorce. That meant there were no holds barred. And she was kidnapped 2 times.
Oh my goodness.
And her first 5 years were spent in a house and with a cousin who had been adopted by her aunt and uncle who raised her. Her mom and dad really didn't. And she told me the address and the window at Swansea. It looked out over the bay. She said, I always remember looking out there with my cousin, and who had been adopted. His name was, I think, Robert Norris or Ben Norris. And but the house is still there. The window's still there. I looked it up. And I guess her brother, she did have one other brother who was 11 years older than she was. Anyway, her cousin was going to, I believe it was Norwich in Vermont. And so she went up there for party, and she was probably 17 or something like that. Anyway, she met a man up there named Cummins, and they got married. She lied about her age. And she said back then when you got married and you didn't tell the family, they disowned you. And his family did. But they got married, and he was going to be a pilot. He had a pilot's license, and Ben got a pilot's license. Her brother got a pilot's license, and they got married. He was going to be a midshipman, but he decided he wanted to go. He was in the Air Force, but he wanted to be a midshipman. So he goes to Columbia, to the midshipman school, Columbia University in New York. He's assigned to a submarine. They have a child. They've got a kid. And so he goes out and trains, and they end up moving over to the West Coast, and which is where the port was. So he had 4 patrols on different submarines. He was finishing his last submarine tour, and was training people on. I think he was on the Cisco was one of them. There were 3 others. I think this one was the Minger. I may be wrong, but he was on the conning tower training them, and they were in the South China Sea, and a tidal wave approached them. They had to go down immediately. 2 guys and her husband. They weren't on the sub, and they were in the South China Sea. And here I am with my child. I didn't find out except through a word of mouth. I hadn't even somebody told me about it, and then later she received, the telegram. But that was then, and it was crazy at that time. People blame people for this and that, but the fact is there was just so much going on. It's just hard to do. And she had discussed with her husband that she was going to go to the University of Miami, get her degree, and also learn to fly at Embry-Riddle, which was attached to the University of Miami. And she did that. On her way down there in their car, she has her child. They're in Montgomery, Alabama. They're eating at a restaurant. She comes out. Someone's stolen her car.
Oh.
He said it was the worst moment of her life. She said, I had nothing except my child. Now, So she goes and teaches, she gets her degree, she gets her commercial license. She teaches men who came back, from the war, and others who wanted to get their commercial license. She taught them these things. And she met her husband. They had met with groups, in New York with her husband, and they just mingled. They'd write letters back and forth. It was really not the type, it's not like today's letter. If you meet somebody, you have to do something. Not then. It was different. The morals were different. The ethics were different. It was just going to have a good time. And she ended up marrying this man, and he was everything she wasn't. He was an engineer. He was going to be a doctor, and became an engineer. And he'd take her out camping and things she had never done in her life. And she had her, and of course she has a child, for a lot of men, that's baggage. It wasn't to him. And, but it doesn't end there. They get together. His name was Lum Lamore. No one's heard of him. He was a Marine pilot in World War II. He was an ace. He shot, I think, five planes down. Yeah. But the story doesn't end there. After, during the war, she had her brother was reported as missing in action. He was a pilot for MacArthur and a photographer. He was in the Bataan Death March. She hadn't heard from him. Her cousin that she lived with and was 5 years old, and probably longer than that, with her aunt and uncle, he was killed. He was a squad leader with the Marines and was killed at Leyte in 1945. Her husband was lost at sea. So she had lost the three most important men in her life that she knew. And she was able to make that adjustment from losing all of this to starting a new life. And I remember asking her, how do you do it? How do you go through something like this and do it? I mean, most people just quit. She said, I just took it as a sign of fate, that what happens, you have to go and move on. What will be, and moved on. Didn't say that it didn't affect her, but she said, I have to get on with my life and my kid, because I promised my husband, what I was going to do. Because, when you go to sea, submariners or submariners, however you want to pronounce it, they had 50% losses in the U.S. It was 100% in the German subs. So wow. You knew what was probably going to happen. And so those are three people that I got to know well, not just as an interview, but because I was lucky enough at that time to be around. And they're all from Dallas. It's not unlike Fort Worth. I can't get over here like I want to, even though I've really developed some close relationships with the roll call folks. But yeah, even guys like, how much time you got? 5 minutes?
About 5 minutes. Yes, sir.
Another fella, his wife is his name is Andrew Brzezinski. He was a Polish kid, I think 13 or 14 years old, when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939. And he went into the underground, and they caught him. He was assigned to Auschwitz, and I think Mauthausen is where he was shipped to. He was still a kid. And he said the only reason he survived, he said he had so many angels on his shoulder. He became a cook for the doctors. And that's how he survived, and he got out of it. He still had his numbers on his arm, but he turned his life around, seeing the very worst one. He was Catholic, by the way, and because they took no mercy on Catholics either, but he turned his life around, and he and his Pat had a wonderful marriage with kids. And another fella, John Ray Lemons, who I got to know really well in Dallas. He was a class of 37 with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had the largest ROTC program in the country. And he used to play flag football, not flag, but what do you call it? Dirt football or playground football. And one of the guys he used to play against was Davey O'Brien from Tennessee. He's still alive today. Ray is 103, living in Arkansas. I visited him about 8 or 9, 10 months ago. And but he graduated from Woodrow, went to SMU. He was a radio operator gunner, I believe is what he was. He was on what is called the infamous Castle mission, and they made a wrong turn, his bomb group. Out of 35 planes, 29 were shot down in 8 to 10 minutes. The Germans thought they were being invaded. There were so many parachutes in the air. And Ray managed to bail out. And I think not everybody bailed out. They lost, I think, 3 or 4, maybe 5 out of the crew survived, but they murdered several on the ground. And I got to, of course, we're trying to kill them. They weren't the happiest with they weren't really happy with our Army Air Force at the time, but it wasn't unusual to be pitchforked to death or beaten to death if you bailed out. He was saved. He was being beaten badly by Big Stoop, and who was one of the German guards. And they pulled him out of the line, or he would have been beaten to death. And but he said that out of that, I think 3 or 4 of his group survived, became POWs, and they took him to Frankfurt. And he was saved by the Luftwaffe. Luftwaffe didn't do this. They took care of because we had treated them well in the past. And so they took them to Frankfurt. And he said, if you'd been here yesterday, you would have seen a dozen American airmen hanging from the rafters.
Wow.
But he was also, he was in 3 or 4 different prison camps. He went I think Barth was where he ended up. But when the Russians closed in, the Germans were going to use these prisoners as a collateral, as a negotiating point. So he was in that long winter march. And he said, it was really bad. We didn't lose too many. Some people died along the way, but it wasn't as bad because nobody had it good, not even the German guards. They said we were fortunate these guards were 60-year-olds. And we helped them carry their rifles. And the reason being because there was nowhere to go, but we did not want the SS. And so they would pick them up, and they were as humane as they could be, but they went from one camp to the next and were finally liberated at Moosburg, that was a huge gathering compound. And he said the last they saw, there was Big Stoop dead. Somebody finally got even with him because he'd beaten a number of people. But the tales go on and on. There's just no way to remember all of it. And a matter of fact, as soon as you I said, oh God, how am I going to remember all these things? So I have to go back and look at the interviews, and that takes hours to go through. Yeah. You've got to look at everything. But it would also make me look back and see just remind me that what I'm doing is the right thing to do.
Sure.
Without a doubt, because then I began to listen to them, and I'd forgotten about a lot of this stuff. But those families now get that. That was only one purpose, and that was to give these to their families, and that's it. I'm not mentioned, nobody's mentioned, but it was only to give it back to them. And that's really
and that's really important because it was a year or so ago that I was contacted, roll call through our Contact Us page on our website. We were contacted by a family whose loved one had passed, and they had not known about the disc. They didn't have any of this information, and they found this disc, and they were like, they tried to play it to see what was there, and they couldn't, but it had your information apparently on it, because they reached out and they said, hey, we got this disc, we can't play it, and we'd really love another copy. We're happy to pay for it. And I'm like, hey, I'm just going to contact Chuck. And I did. And he said, oh, that was one of the first interviews I did. I've got it. He sent it to him. He doesn't charge those families anything for this. And they were so incredibly grateful for having that.
And the key is you don't take money from them, because you just cannot take money from a veteran. They've done enough. It's time for somebody else to step up and help them. This is something I can't give them money. I don't have that much money, but I can give them something that will last a long time. And especially growing up as a kid, I found that more fun talking about growing up as a kid than I do the war.
Yeah.
Because, we go through radio programs, TV shows, odd jobs, the movie theaters. Here in Fort Worth, when I talked to them, Everybody's was a place.
Everybody's.
Yeah, that was the off price from Leonard's, yes, from Leonard's department store, when they had the big Christmas shows there. Yeah. The trains went on. I learned more about Fort Worth in my interviews than I ever knew in my life. So, yeah.
And that's what I find with a lot of these veterans is, we'll be together, maybe a car ride someplace, and it's not about the war, it's about life. And about, even with Woody Williams, I spent several days with him in a hotel, and we'd just be the only ones in the lobby sometime. Yeah. And he would just talk about when he was a kid, not about Iwo Jima or the Medal of Honor, right. But a lot of them.
You get to know them as a person. Yeah, forget them being
absolutely.
A general or a private or whatever it might be. That's not what I'm after. I really never have been.
How can people get in touch with you if they?
Good. Well,
they can always contact us.
Roll call.
Right, contact roll call.
And we can get you in touch.
Because normally I have to go ambush people. They're not going to walk up to me. Yeah, come over to my house and I want to sit down. And I can't tell them how long some of these take, but because then they might back out. But they're kind of intimidated that they're going to be interviewed. They're just not used to it.
Yeah.
And it's hard to tell people, others people have to vouch for you
Yeah.
to give you any credibility. One of the things that I do, besides just the interviews, I have them sign prints. I buy them over the internet and have them sign it. And these are all donated to museums. I've got 4 at the Frontiers of Flight and 3 at the University of Texas at Dallas, 2 in Norwich, England. I've got 1 at Boxted, England, and I've got 1 in Picaville, France. And so this is one of the, I don't think you'll be able to get this on there, but this took nearly 4 years to complete. And this is a copy of the one that's in Picaville, France. And all those were D-Day veterans that either jumped that day, flew over, or came in through the beaches.
And you had them sign this.
Yes, I had them sign it. Well, I'd go to the different ceremonies because they've got them planted all over. And you'll see a lot of paratroopers in here. Bob Bearden from Dallas Adamson's in there, Francis Williamson, who saw General Fowley killed, who was the Highland Park barber. He signed it, and Howard Hubner, others have signed this thing. I've talked to all of them. But then it goes to a museum. It's not for me to keep or to make money. I've got maybe 1 or 2 left that are for charity, that I raise money for charities. And so I put it out there, and I put who is in it, how many, what they did, a little bit of a description of them, and then people bid on it, and it doesn't go to me. It goes to charities. And then I also have them sign books like this one.
I've noticed you at roll call having things.
And this just
signed.
goes on. This is my most signed book. It just goes on. God, it goes on. Even on the back is signed in here. And so I just keep going here and here, and then see the blank pages I go. I'll just keep going all the way top to bottom. But then I'm going to donate all those. All those are going to be given away to whoever's willing to put up with it, $400 or how many there are. But the whole purpose was never to take anything from a veteran. It was to give back to them what they've given to me.
You've done a good job with that.
Yes, you
So-
absolutely have.
Great job.
Yes. And so if you do have a story and you would like to get it out there, or really just get it down and have it there for your family,
Archive.
because, we don't think about that until it's almost too late, that, we wish we would have left more of our story for our family. And that's really important. So get a hold of us, info@roll-call.org, and we will get you in touch with Chuck. And he absolutely does a fabulous job getting this all down for you. So we are
He's got
eternally
such a
grateful.
passion for,
Yes, he
for
does.
the veterans.
Yes, he does.
Chuck, we appreciate you being here today. We're going to have a number 2 interview with the interviewer.
Yes.
Well, okay. Now I'm ready for both. Well, all 3 of you.
You've done a magnificent job of sharing just a glimpse of some of these people that you've got to interview, and it's given us a good, a good history lesson in a lot of different things that we wouldn't know.
Right.
Well, you saw that with the roll call people.
Yeah.
With Jim Holsom. I don't know if you remember Jim. We became practically best buddies. Here's a guy who was on the Los Banos raid. He's a guy I would talk about the next time. Just a character, and but not a wild man. But he was in the Los Banos raid where they rescued 2,100 civilians who had dug their graves. They were going to be executed. These are men and women and children. These are not veterans. They were going to execute them. And that's what the Kimpy Tide did. McFisk Hanley knows exactly what the Kimpy Tide did.
Sure did.
So he was the only company selected to jump over Los Banos, and they jumped out. And on the backside there were the Philippine guerrillas, and our guys were coming in from Manila across the bay. But he was just one of those interviews and one of those great guys that you meet once in a lifetime. But roll call, I tell you, people don't understand how much roll call. They spend a lot of time, but the real meaning comes in the fellowship with these veterans because they feel isolated. They do not like what's going on. We have different, from one political aspect to another, but they feel isolated. And this is a great way to bring them together. A free meal. These things are not inexpensive. These meals are expensive, but they go out and raise money, for the veterans, and groups give money to roll call. Roll call provides a lot more services than just being. We're going to meet. They have outsources. I've never heard of a group that goes out and packs books into boxes. helps move people from one place to the next. I mean, it's extraordinary. What I do, this is a different thing that roll call does. Mine's sitting down in front of someone. I think what roll call does, and the members and the volunteers is exceptional. It really makes veterans feel like they're not underappreciated anymore. I need help, so they go get them. And the key is finding out before they even ask if you can.
That's right. And that's why Larry, has given us the opportunity so we can celebrate those veterans, those people that support the veterans and do work like you do. So
now, Larry,
wish we had done it 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
Yep. And our next luncheon is coming up on the 28th of October. I think we're going to open the window to RSVP, and I'll have that information out by the time I talk to you next week. We should have all the information on what system we're using to RSVP, because we did just sign on with a new organization to try to help us with some of these technology type things. So we'll have that information. So by next Tuesday, I should have the newsletter out, and everybody should know how to RSVP and when it's done and when they need to get that RSVP. And so again, if you haven't checked us out, make sure you go to our website at www.roll-call.org and just check us out. And you can sign up to be a new attendee. If you want to come to the lunches, you can sign up right there. You'll get the newsletter along with anything else that I send out. If you just want the newsletter, you don't live local, you just want to know what's going on, what we're doing, you can sign up for the newsletter there. And if you are in a location where you want to set up a roll call chapter, we're working with one group that's meeting in Lubbock here tomorrow or the next day. And they may start up one in Lubbock, but if you're somewhere where you've got some folks in a place, and even if you just take 10 veterans to lunch, we'll help you get started.
What were you going to say a while ago?
I was going to say one beautiful thing about roll call. It started with Kevin Bolt, but they have never missed a beat with the people moving with the group. It has gotten better and better and better and better. And the other thing, you're not interviewing a hero here. I just interview heroes. So don't, I didn't do anything.
You're our hero.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Larry, we got the bike giveaway, bike and helmet giveaway. Tell us about that.
I've given bikes away this is the 36th year, tens of thousands of bikes. This year's goal is 750 bikes and 750 helmets. We've got a lot of partners that have signed up with us, business partners. The Aerospace and Machinists Union at Lockheed is on board. Several restaurants, different businesses, car dealerships. So it's the Saturday before Christmas, which this year will be December 17th. And it's a community event. We'll have, I imagine, Maddie Parker, our mayor, will be there this year. We get city council members, Fort Worth PD and Fort Worth FD. They give bikes and they help give them away. So anybody from roll call or any of y'all that want to participate in the giveaway, it's going to happen. It'll either be this parking lot or next door. And we start real early in the morning, 6 o'clock. It's over by 8:30.
Yeah, we'll be getting you some volunteers for sure.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And some bicycles.
And some bicycles. That'll be fantastic.
Well, we have had a good show today.
Great
Chuck,
show.
We thank you for coming over here. We're going to post some pictures that you brought. We'll post some of those pictures of some of the people that you've interviewed. And you said you had a little video too, and we'll post that for you too.
Yeah, the video is from the Ernie Pyle Museum in Dana, Indiana. And we're going to start spending our summers in Indiana. And it's one of the most emotional things I've ever seen. For 5 minutes. And, I've been to the museums all over the country. These are all volunteers, just like roll call. I've never seen anything this emotional in my life for 5 minutes. And it's the death of Lieutenant or Wascom or Captain Wascom in Italy. And Ernie Pyle wrote this short story about bringing the bodies down the mountain, and they line them up and then they bury them. And then the men but this one is particular. I'm not going to give it away, but I've never seen anything like it. My wife started crying when she listened to it.
And we'll post that to our roll call and also the Hometown Heroes. This has been a good show, Larry. Thank you so much for your sponsorship and for helping us. Chuck, thank you, sir.
Oh, no, thank you.
Being here. And we look forward to some more stories from Chuck. Mary, we'll see you next week.
Absolutely.
And next week we have one of the people who was a child during the bombing of London. So
Wow.
he's got some good stories
Yes,
to tell.
he does.
David Huntley.
Yes, he does.
Great
So
show.
we'll see y'all next week. Thank y'all for being part of Hometown Heroes.